Hello and welcome to Unapologetically Technical. This is the show that's different. We go deep, we go all the way down. With me today is Shane Murray. Shane is the field CTO at Monte Carlo Data. Welcome to the show, Shane. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse, and thanks for having me on today. So I guess a bit of background for me. I was born in Sydney, Australia. I've lived in New York for the past 15 years. In Australia, I studied math, as US audience will know it, and finance at the University of New South Wales. In New York, as you mentioned, I'm the field CTO at Monte Carlo, where I currently lead really our research and product strategy around generative AI, considering how we extend our capabilities into this sort of new and emerging space. And for fun, I play a lot of soccer in New York, or football. It's a great place for that. It's really easy to find a game, and you tend to meet people from all walks of life from all over the world. So it's been great to sort of meet hundreds of people playing football over the years here.
And that's when you know you've lived in the US too long, where you say words at once.
Yes.
Soccer/football.
Yeah, sometimes you got to slightly adjust the language to be comprehended and understood. So,
But I thought they just called it footy.
So footy in Australia is either Australian rules football, rugby league, or rugby union. So there's three other football codes. So I grew up calling it soccer, but in Australia over the past, I think 20 or so years, it's switched to being another of the football codes. But it rarely goes by footy.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood this time because I watched. If people have never seen Australian rules football, and you compare that to a U.S. American football, NFL example, and my Australian friends would tell me this American football is so boring, and I would say, "Oh no, it's exciting! There's touchdowns." And then I watched Australian rules, and I thought, "No, this is what football should have been. No pads." You guys run and hit hard. There's no stupid timeouts where everybody just kind of surrounds. Is that your take as well?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. I tend to wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. to watch my team, which is the Sydney Swans. Very fearsome mascot, the Swan. But it's a great sport to watch, and you're right, it's nonstop. They can run in any direction. They're kicking the ball at goal. It kind of is an amalgamation of many sports, but it's great to watch.
I've enjoyed watching it. I watched it, and I watched rugby. There was a rugby match here, and I went to it. It was South Africans. Some South African won the World Cup. They called them the South African Legends. So I was there on the field and around a bunch of these guys who everybody knew, and I knew nothing about them. And it was exciting. It was really interesting to see. One thing I can't tell you is how surreal it was to be on the field and hear those hits. Where when you hear him, I'm sitting and chumming at you downtown if you're a bad day. But when it's this one guy who's 300 pounds, 150 kilograms, hitting the guys at 100 kilograms, and you're right near that, it's a way. It's hard to explain just how it's kind of like the offensive line at first start on the American, and they hit each other right quick. When they do a tackle in rugby, it's two big guys who can run one move well.
Yeah, it's a brutal sport. I mean, I think American football, they throw themselves at each other harder, but obviously they have some protection to do that. But yeah, the Australian rules also, if you watch it, they throw themselves in the air and they're running at full speed. It's all of these sports are kind of crazy to watch. So I stick to soccer in terms of playing.
Okay. And yeah, watching those rugby players move, they weren't that old. They were in their 40s, but some of them you could see the soul on them, or they'd be for slow off field and they get on the field and could still really go. But it didn't give me this, oh wow, I want to play this and hurt myself.
No, that it takes a special type of person.
And does Australian rules do the scrums too? I loved watching when they push each other up and no.
Yeah, so not as such. There's actually a throw in Australian rules where you have a position. I'm getting deep now. There's a position called a rock, who these two tall guys who are in the rock, who are maybe 6'8" or something, are competing to get a tap. So it's somewhat similar, but it's not the same as rugby where they all kind of line up for this line out.
Oh. Well, very related to that, let's talk about how would you go from being your background. You talked about your background of being an analyst, and that was what you originally came up as, and now you're a CTO. How would you suggest people make that switch or that transition?
Yeah, so I mean, even back to my sort of university degree, it was actually kind of an experimental degree that was a mix of math and finance, and included a fair degree of programming. I was actually well versed in MATLAB, and so not used so much today, but doing a lot of programming in that degree in MATLAB. But I found as I progressed in my career, what I really ventured into through various roles was how I could work with different functional experts. And so in my second job, I worked very closely with engineers, and I was actually, bringing kind of new model forms into the software, but then working with engineers on things like speed versus memory trade-offs, and how my code could actually become code that was in our software. And so I had some experience working with engineers. And then when I went into roles subsequent with that, I worked closely with designers and product managers. And, by later in my career, when I was at the New York Times, I'd worked across enough functional areas that I started to lead those engineering and product teams that were focused on particularly building out data platform capabilities. Was where I kind of specialized as a leader. I would say my current role right now, a field CTO, I'm not the CTO. I'm actually someone who's out in the field, much more doing kind of product research and development at the moment, and actually working with a lot of CDOs and CTOs in various companies that are customers of Monte Carlo, to understand what problems they're trying to solve and how we can be a great partner for them.
Oh, good. So you talked about this role being experimental. Or excuse me, your degree being experimental. Did they keep on doing it, or what happened with that experiment?
That's a good question. I would say I can't say for sure, but it certainly felt like, so this is back in early 2000s when I was at university. It's certainly, looking back on it, it was really valuable to be applying a lot of what I was doing in mathematics to a field like finance. So I was going deep into some of the theory behind analytical finance and applied finance, but also going deep on the math side, and higher linear algebra and graph theory and things like that allowed me to bring expertise to that field, and then kind of bridge that with a level of computer science. I wouldn't say it was a deep course in computer science, but definitely learning tools like MATLAB and how you could use them to solve deep analytical problems. But yeah, I think I hope they continue to, because I actually found it, it was a double degree, and I found it to be incredibly valuable, in each direction that I've taken in my career.
Well, good. Yeah, you kind of mentioned some of the places you went in your career. So let's start talking about those. Your first one out of school was with Wilcott Research, and you were doing, looked like marketing, social marketing. So was your research focus there?
Yeah, the company was definitely probably a mix of social marketing research, but predominantly marketing research. And where I ended up focusing in my time there was building out a capability around a technique that's known as choice modeling. Have you come across choice modeling?
Yeah.
And so, really, that was about how do we model the decision process of an individual or a population via what's called revealed preferences. And it's a mix of kind of behavioral decision making and economic theory. And an example, would have been we worked with one of the big cruise liners at the time. And so when they were trying to figure out, what sort of cruise packages they should sell to the market, which could include the various price points, the duration of those packages, the destinations, all these different attributes that go into how someone makes a decision about whether they purchase something. And I would design fairly complex experiments around all those various attributes. We would put that sort of survey out into the market to have thousands of respondents respond to it, and then I would use these analytical techniques, a lot of logistic regression modeling, to both model out those behaviors and then to simulate what it looks like for a population. And so that is a pretty common approach that companies use to sort of test the market with new offerings that they plan to seed and see which ones will actually gain the biggest market share. And so I was building some programs around that, as well as doing a lot of analytics on the research, but really kind of lent into this experimentation.
And so, for example, you talked about this cruise line. What was the effect on that cruise line?
Well, I mean, generally the effect, some of these are, and this will maybe get into my next role, but some of these are survey-based research, or they were survey-based research. So you don't necessarily have a direct connection to the impact, right? They would take that research and then go and launch the products. And, I wasn't necessarily close to tracking what the actual result of that. I think in my next phase, I started doing a lot more kind of online experimentation where you actually see the impact of what you're launching.
Well, let's talk about that. So you went to Memetrics. That was the company where you were mentioning. So it seems really hard to really do programming, for example, if you're not in front working with your customer, you don't know what's happening. Is that what you kind of realized? I need to be online, need to be working more with the customer to do this right.
Yeah, I think I was looking for a new challenge, and one that kind of pushed on some of the things I was learning and teaching myself. It was a bit fortuitous that I found this startup in Sydney. I don't think at the time Sydney had a huge startup scene. There was actually some founders who had moved from California to Sydney and were surfing on the Sydney beaches and decided to start a company called Memetrics. And it was one of the first, if not the first, company that was designing a methodology and a software around running online experiments. And of course, I'm sure companies might have been doing it on their own, but this is early 2000s, and I joined them in 2005. It wasn't very common for someone to launch a website and run a bunch of experiments to see what content they should make up the experience with. And so I joined there, and the opportunity there, we were running, experiments with large companies like American Express, eBay was a customer, Comcast, massive retailers in Germany and China. And so you were working with these customers where, rather than doing survey-based research that I was before, they had some of the biggest traffic on the globe sometimes, and you could run a really powerful experiment in a matter of days or weeks, which was pretty revolutionary compared to survey-based research. And so I took a lot of those techniques that I'd kind of taught myself at the first job around choice modeling, which is actually the foundation of the Memetrics software, and use that to kind of lead up the analytics and the data science around how we ran these experiments, how we designed experiments, how we deployed them, and then how we ultimately optimized to that outcome, which might be, card applications or lifetime value from card applications for American Express, or it might be basket value or checkout value for an e-commerce company like eBay. And I mentioned before, but because it was a 25-person company, I had the luxury of both being in this kind of client analytics services role, but also working closely with the engineers to add new model forms to the Memetrics software. And so I was lucky enough to be sort of programming multi-arm bandit-like capabilities into the software that started to advance what we were doing.
And these weren't simulations. These were actual, I'm going to run this on American Express, for example. So what was one of the outcomes that surprised you the most, where there was some variable to it and you would have never guessed that variable had an effect?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'll get to your answer, but one of the funny things we would do at the time, so we were running what's called multivariate experiments. We might have hundreds or even in the thousands of treatments that were a combination of all the attributes we were testing. And what we would do at the start of the experiment was do a sweepstakes where people voted on what they thought the winner would be. Right. And really the reason for doing that is to show everyone that, like, we're not as good in our individual judgment as if we start collecting observations and even the average of a group was usually better than an individual. I think we did some pretty interesting and revolutionary experiments at the time. Trying to think of some examples. In terms of American Express, it was often like experimenting with the layout of cards on the page, how you kind of prioritize the order of those, the sort of density of benefits you displayed and what benefits you prioritized. And actually, one of the experiments that surprised me, to your question, we were working with kind of the equivalent of eBay in China, a company called 360 Buy. And so we took a lot of what we had seen in our American experiments to try to apply it to this company, which was, let's reduce the density of the website. Let's cut it down to, as simple as possible so it's clear what someone needs to do, versus what the website had been, which was kind of mimicking like a Chinese marketplace, which is a very different setup to an American marketplace. And our test design, basically failed because people actually wanted the sort of range of items to be able to go through on this Chinese website. So that one was probably the most surprising over the years, just in terms of the findings.
That would be interesting, that there's this very deep cultural aspect to our choices. If you've ever read, and what was that called? It was Culture Map. I don't know if you ever read the Culture Map.
No, I haven't.
I just read it. It was pretty interesting. She wasn't going about it from an analytics point of view. She was more saying, here is culture, and here's how culture affects us, and on these various parts, and you see that kind of shot through in our choices of products, or technically, it was more about management. But yes, it's amazing how our cultural impacts, our cultural, even our starting points affect this?
I mean, I think what I learned during that time was that, often people would come in and they'd think about maybe what was easiest to experiment with. And you often hear these examples like Google testing 30 shades of blue, or, which, or people wanting to test a button color or button copy. But I think what it taught me is when you get true experts into a room that think about how people buy or think about good design, you can actually get much stronger hypotheses. And so running workshops and then translating that into hypotheses and then building an experiment design that tested bolder things was something I definitely carried throughout my career at places like the New York Times.
Now, as you look at that culture, since you've now been in the US for a while, you being Australian, they're pretty similar cultures, but at the same time different. What's been a difference you've seen between them that surprised you?
Uh, it's a good question. I think the I mean the work culture is quite different. And I'm not sure I can even now explain exactly how, but like I'm very used to a New York work culture, which is very competitive. And I think there's probably something about work that's a lot more social in Australia, even though I think people work very hard. I think it's it's there's a bit more of a social culture embedded in the nature of work. And it's, as a result, I think it's a little, sometimes a friendlier culture. Um, uh, and then I think just like I regularly go back to Australia and visit, and Sydney especially. The difference between Sydney, you know, uh, you go out at 6 a.m. and the whole world is awake, but then it's actually kind of and that might be some of navigating time zones with the rest of the world these days, but it's a very early rising culture, and everyone's out being quite social and energetic at 6 a.m. Or a lot of people seemingly, compared to what I see in New York, which is much more of a night culture, right? People tend to rise late and stay out pretty late in New York. So I don't know that I have a great answer for your question, but it's kind of funny to see the different dynamics as I go back and forth.
I'm always surprised. And I did love it. If people have never been to Sydney, it's absolutely beautiful to walk along the harbor there. There's some great food places, and then probably the other one was the having beets in your burger was
Yeah.
surprisingly good. I was surprised.
Do you like that? Do you like a beet in your hamburger?
I did. I do like my beets in my burger. Haven't had it since, but I mean, I would eat it. I have to say, I've traveled a lot. I eat a lot of Vegemite is the absolute most disgusting thing ever. I've rarely spit something out in my life, and I could not take the Vegemite.
So I mean, I'm with you on beets in a burger. I think it's underappreciated, and most people would probably scoff at it until you try it. It's got like adds a like nice sweetness to the burger, and but I'm not a Vegemite eater. I think you have to start eating Vegemite when you're a young kid to be able to really appreciate it. Like I think it's one of those tastes that you need to actually absorb when you're way younger than I am.
Right? I've heard that too, so I'll take your word.
But yeah, I'd agree. The food scene in Sydney is amazing. A lot of great Asian food, a lot of great food from places like Turkey and Lebanon. Um, a great coffee culture. It's a really good food scene for those who are considering going.
Yeah, definitely check it out. So from there, you went to Accenture Interactive. They describe it as the world's largest tech creative group that blends creativity, innovation, and technology. How did you that?
So I think Accenture's evolved a lot since I was there, which is, close to 14 or so years ago. I arrived there through the acquisition of Memetrics, the startup I was at in Sydney. So there was a group within Accenture at the time called Accenture Marketing Services, who mostly did media mix modeling. So modeling out the impact of marketing campaigns for large companies using time series modeling. But they didn't really have a footprint in digital at the time. And so this is like 2008. And so they bought Memetrics along with a couple of other companies in the startup space. And they used that as the kind of foundation, both from talent and technology, to build a group called Accenture Interactive, which is what the group I was in became. So what it practically meant for me was going from a 30-person software startup to a 250,000 person consulting company that frankly I had never even heard of. So this I was a little ignorant to the global consulting arms, but I came into Accenture, and it meant that I shifted my role from being this kind of back office analyst and contributing to the software to actually kind of leading up delivery teams. And that's actually when I moved to New York in 2009, was to lead up delivery teams here. And both in terms of, large scale experiment delivery at companies like American Express and JP Morgan, but also starting to get into this kind of strategic consulting where we would go into organizations and advise them on how to build an experimentation culture and team within their organization. So I went into a bunch of organizations in the US and Europe and did some engagements to try to build out experimentation teams within them.
That is interesting. I want to go back to you. You made the jump to management. Was that kind of a panic move? Was that something that you'd wanted to do?
So management, I was kind of reluctant when my boss suggested I start managing people, but I think I had already been playing a role kind of unofficially as a mentor for our other analysts on the team, the newer hires. And I was kind of enjoying that side of the role. But this was probably 2007 or so when I started managing people. It was a little bit reluctant at the time, but over time I realized that's one way you can have outsized impact is leading teams like that. And throughout the years since, I've really enjoyed both kind of the side of I'd say like fostering people's careers and being a sounding board as they're thinking about their journey, but also figuring out how to make cross-functional teams really gel around a set of objectives and priorities and problems to be solved.
That is interesting. And then, kind of coming forward, you said that you worked with a bunch of companies around the world to help them set up their teams. What lessons did you take away from seeing both good and bad teams along the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think oftentimes what I'd go into, I was, because it was Accenture, we were going into Fortune 500 companies, and it's probably the first time I saw like companies that are really slow moving, right? Because I think when we had been at a startup, you tend to work with early adopters who are have some ambition to do something different and quite innovative. And some of the companies I've mentioned were those that were doing experimentation before it was really a popular thing across product teams and marketing teams. But I think with Accenture, I started to walk into companies who would have 10 people around the table and a lot of discussion and very little movement. And so, I think sometimes you're looking for, in those teams, where's the spark? Who are the people that are the spark, who you can work with, who have some ambition to see some change. Because there's always that sort of thread in organizations as well. Someone that's, a change maker and trying to actually get stuff done. But yeah, it was an interesting time. I still saw like, a lot of talented people, but a lot of people that had been in roles for, 10 or 20 years.
So talking about that, it made me think of a thing I've been thinking about, and it's the safety of no. No is the safest decision that you can make because you can always say no, and you'll never be proven wrong because you said no. And so you having that background in choice management and choices, what do you think about that no?
Yeah, I mean, I think so choice modeling sort of starts to look at how people weigh the utility of the decisions they can make, right? And so there's a conscious component to your decision, an unconscious component, and the conscious component is them taking all of the attributes of that decision and saying, what's the utility of those and how do they sum up? That's at least how it works mathematically. And I think you do get these personas in sort of senior level roles, especially where sometimes it is a defensive stance, right? And I think some of this exists today in like how teams are adopting AI is, am I going to be defensive and make sure that like I'm being seen to do something, or am I actually taking the lead and starting to, build applications and see where the frailties are and, potentially have some failures along the way. But I think it's that there's an element of risk aversion there. And I think there's an element of like, what you're trying to achieve personally that bleeds into how you make those decisions.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with you that's you're basically mathematically, or if you're an analyst. But there's also this theory that I've heard of. We have an irrational decision that we're seeking to rationalize with some logic. Is that
Right.
your experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I've certainly seen over my time justification for a decision that may not be purely logical, right? And I think that's the thing that differentiates good data people from mediocre ones is like, how do you deal with that scenario? Because really what they're putting out there is a hypothesis, and sometimes the data is not going to matter, right? Or the decision is made and you're sort of, they're in a position to justify it. And I think what I've seen sort of the best thing to do for high integrity data organizations is to show that decision for what it's worth. What are the first order impacts of making that decision, and make sure everyone goes in eyes wide open for when, the thing might not succeed.
Okay. So you mentioned at Accenture, you moved to New York, and then you joined the New York Times. So why would a newspaper need such a strong analytics team that you'd be at that level?
Yeah, so I joined there to I think it was about a 12-person analytics team that had been brought together that had some data scientists, but there was a separate group in the company that was doing engineering and had just hired their first data scientist. So it was a kind of a split org at the time. But I mean, to answer your question, a lot of news organizations at the time, and probably still, what they were talking about was digital transformation. How do we go from what is a predominantly a print centric company where all of our, most of our revenues are, I'll say. And back when I joined in 2013, that was certainly the case. Most of the revenue was coming from print, and become a digital technology organization. And also, in 2009, basically the entire ad market was wiped out for publishers, right? Certain SKUs, they lost 90% of the revenue in the course of 12 months or so. And a lot of that ad market shifted, of course, to the likes of Google and Facebook and others. But the ad business was a fraction of what it was. And that had historically been the business that made publishers successful. And so then it was transitioning the business to a digital subscription business. And I would say when I joined, like, we didn't really have even data at the user level, at the reader level. The data was often counting page views and aggregating how many page views. And that's because that's how the ad business worked. It worked on ad impressions. People didn't necessarily think about, all right, what's the user experience? What are our users doing? Data wasn't really used like that. There were some pockets of the organization that were playing with this sort of data, but it certainly wasn't the predominant thing. And so, I saw my role as playing a part in that digital transformation, a small but I think significant part that data and technology organizations were playing in transformation. And one of the things I brought in was this history and expertise in running experiments. And so I brought an experimentation culture to how we did things like determine the right paywall that maximizes subscription revenue, or we're about to launch a new homepage experience was actually one of the first projects I did, how to ensure that homepage actually increases the engagement of our readers. And then, as you get further in, where are we consuming news? There was obviously a splintering of news consumption across search and social and other platforms. And so bringing both experimentation, but also an analytical problem-solving set to, which are the right partnerships and how do we build out the New York Times as a destination for readers and not simply be read through third parties. So it's become, I think, through the sort of distribution channels, the way you build a product that is engaging and builds good habits of news reading, and then the revenue models, digital subscription and digital advertising, these are all heavily data-driven exercises that the team I ran was working through.
You mentioned the team starting out with 2 orgs being put under you. How did things start, and how did you end them in organizational setup?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned at the time I came in 2013, and I brought kind of an experimentation culture to analytics. At the same time, a counterpart of mine was hired, a chief data scientist, Chris Wiggins, who was bringing in machine learning as a new concept for the Times. So that was 2013. In about 2015, we actually brought all the data groups together. And then I was leading various analytics teams, but also the data platform team. And we made the decision at that point to move from what was a on-premise Hadoop solution to become a very early customer of Google Cloud Platform and BigQuery and all the component parts in Google Cloud. And so that was, a massive initiative in 2015 that was huge technology change. And I would say that was one of the things that sort of drove us to a different level. We were able to do so much more from just getting that migration right. And then, my last 3 years there, so 2018 to 21, I was leading all of data. So that was the data platform organization, all of the data scientists and machine learning engineers, and all of the data analysts that I had actually deployed out in marketing, advertising, newsroom, engagement product teams, growth product teams, new product teams. So that was a group of about 160 that I was leading, in kind of a hub and spoke model, as people in data often talk about. The hub being the platform group where all the engineering was happening, and the spokes being the kind of analytical work happening out on the edges.
And speaking of the engineering, you didn't mention the engineers. Were they software engineers, the engineers? Who was doing the engineering work?
Yeah, so I led essentially a squad or a group of teams that was about, I'm going to say about 100 people, 90 to 100 people. That was all of the data engineers, and I'd say there were also software engineers within data. That was about 10 teams within the data platform. And the way I organized that group was at the foundational level. We had teams working on kind of the core infrastructure or managing the core infrastructure of data. So what's the platform we bring together to allow people to build data products in the organization? And so that included our core Google stack, but then also other components like orchestration and transformation that we needed to standardize around for the organization. And then, above that, we actually had teams that were working on data engineering teams working on the core kind of data foundations. So how do we model and make available event data for the business that's coming in from 60 different product teams? How do we process commerce data into our subscriber views, into our financial reporting data was a big task. How do we manage advertising data? And for the consumers, how do we make sure this is all essentially a join away so that they can be productive and effective at doing their work? Then on top of that, we had some commercial and homegrown solutions, had a homegrown experimentation platform. We had what's called a CDP, a customer data platform for marketing teams to use. We had BI solutions, both vendor, and we had built a tool for the newsroom that was providing essentially up to the minute readership data on their articles that thousands of journalists were looking at every day. And then finally, and sorry, I'm a bit long-winded here, but we had applied machine learning teams that were focused on really long-run business problems. So there was a machine learning team of both data scientists and machine learning engineers that was optimizing the paywall, the subscription paywall, based on how many articles each person should receive. There's a team focused on algorithmic content recommendations across news products, cooking products, Wirecutter, various properties of the Times. There's a team focused on building out first-party ad targeting solutions with our data. So we had these very effective machine learning teams that were part of the data platform, that were partnered with various parts of the business to solve high-value problems.
You talked about being reticent initially to be a manager, and then it sounds like you have a 200-person org. Sounded about 200.
160.
160. Okay, how do you go from a person who's reticent to manage, probably in the span of, I think, 6 or 7 years, to a 160-person org? What did you do?
I think a lot of people have a bit of a love-hate relationship with management. But I kind of bring it back to two things. One is that, over time, what I did was I was intent on taking very different roles and not having a very linear career path. So when I left Accenture, at the end of Accenture, I was in a very consultative role and not doing much in the way of analytics or the sort of things I really enjoyed, to be honest. And so I was like, all right, I want to be back running a data team and very focused on that as a task. And I want to be on a customer side. So one is sort of taking steps in my career that I at least felt to me like I was taking, 90-degree or turns in my career to solve something new. I think the other is kind of in especially at the times, like embracing how I could partner with experts in the newsroom, in design teams, in product teams. I really enjoy collaborating across teams, and I think to be an effective leader, you have to be good at that. You can't just be a defensive manager for your team. To be effective, you have to actually be a partner for your design counterpart and your product counterpart and your engineering counterpart. And so that was something that I enjoyed, and I think I was effective at and particularly good at. And then the third thing is I think I just like really cared about people and their careers and getting to know them personally. And so I really enjoyed building out teams and seeing people progress within the organization, and even progress outside of the organization. Many of my colleagues from the times I'm still in touch with and following their careers, and that's been probably the thing that's I'm most proud of, is just the role I've played early in their careers.
Yeah, and I think when hopefully people see this in the video or in the interviews, you're not putting on airs, as Americans would say. And I think back to what we were talking about, the Australian culture. The Australian culture is different than the American culture in that there's not a lot of put airs. It's a straightforward. As I've been away from America for a while, I see that America is very good at marketing itself, putting on airs, as it were, whereas other countries they're not trying to market themselves. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah, but I will say, and maybe like why I was somewhat successful at the times was the leadership really cared about high integrity people. It wasn't about, putting on a show as much as it was, are you bringing substance to the conversation? And I was lucky enough to, work with long-standing leaders there and work with CEOs who were phenomenal and colleagues who were phenomenal. So I think like that, I really benefited from that, from seeing some people that rewarded kind of high integrity work.
Well, I think it's more than that. And I think it's we we only do what's meant to us. Uh, in my case, I worked at a lot of things that the model of the manager and the model of the CEO was not very good. In fact, there was things that you'd say, I would avoid that, but until you realize or saw a company where you'd say, that's what I want to do. That's how I act. This is how I want to do that. I experienced that at Cloudera,
Mm-hmm.
where I thought, yes, this is how a company should be run. This is how it should be run and communicate. And is that your experience as well?
Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, and the reward from being in that sort of environment is something that keeps you challenged and keeps you motivated, and you know that you have people that you can go to for really honest mentorship. So I do think there's something culturally I look for in companies, and I've also found that in Monte Carlo, that where you have a degree of like really honest, close relationships with your colleagues, where it's something you can thrive in.
Well, good. Well, speaking of Monte Carlo, let's start talking about it. To start off with, what is Monte Carlo?
Yeah, so Monte Carlo is a data and AI observability company, and I think for a long time in software engineering, there's been companies like Datadog, really leading companies that were up leveling the reliability of software engineering teams. And what Monte Carlo set out to do about 5 years ago when it was founded was bring similar practices to data engineering teams. How do we ensure the reliability of the data products that teams are building? And how do we do that by providing new capabilities that allow you to observe the complexity of data systems that teams are managing? And so let me start with jamming on this board here. But one of the things since day one, Monte Carlo has sought out to solve is a problem of data downtime. I'll try to get neater as I go, but that's my start. And data downtime you can think of as the time to detect, what we call TTD, plus the time to resolve, multiplied by the number of incidents. So, the number of SEVs you might have on your data products. And so that's something that's been a mission of Monte Carlo, is how do we reduce and prevent data downtime from occurring in data products that are valuable to organizations so that they can make more money from them, reduce the risk associated with them, all of that stuff that you're trying to achieve as a data leader. Now, the way that a software like Monte Carlo and a data observability softwares think about this is, in order to address time to detection, you are creating essentially a set of detection monitors across your data. And so that can range from monitoring the freshness of pipelines, how often they're updated. And if you think of what you can do with machine learning, Monte Carlo can learn the freshness of every pipeline, whether it's updated every minute, every 10 minutes, every hour, every day, and learn those patterns such that it will detect when the data is late in arriving. Similarly, there's volume monitors you can create around the volume of data that's being passed through the system. We have schema monitors that detect schema changes, and then also a whole range of what's called kind of field quality and validation monitors on, things like the null rate in a certain data field or column within a data set. So you can understand these anomalies essentially before your customers do, which is the big problem data teams have, is that they're often late to find out the problems in their data, and they find out after their customers. The second set of tools.
Once you're here, you're reactive. So
exactly.
If you're over here and you're making changes to this, that's you're actively making an improvement.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, similar with engineering teams, some amount of downtime can be hard to prevent, right? But it's how you respond to that downtime that sort of changes how data teams are. A lot of data downtime, I would say, teams can completely avoid, but some of it you're responding to new issues that you might find, or system-wide problems that are pretty hard to prevent. But yeah, then we have a set of tools around resolving data issues. So this is both, if you can think of all those monitors, they essentially flow into something like Slack or Microsoft Teams. And then you can start a triage and resolution workflow and do root cause analysis. And Monte Carlo has what's called lineage capabilities. So you can both trace an incident downstream to understand the impact on customers, but also trace it back upstream to understand the root cause. And we have a bunch of both automated and user-friendly capabilities around that. And then the final thing, how do you actually reduce the downtime altogether, or remove the downtime? So we provide a lot of insight through dashboarding, and also other things that even enable you to prevent this downtime. But we often think of this as, I'll just write measure our kind of measurement side. All right, what's contributing to your data downtime, and what are the systematic changes you can make across your data environment to improve this equation?
We touched on it briefly. You were it's a very similar issue, data downtime, of that we were talking about in large orgs. Somebody is very entrenched, or somebody does not really care about this. It may be their job, but they don't really care. So you're trying to get somebody to care make these changes. What have you seen work well in getting people to get up and start doing something?
Yeah. There is kind of this lights on moment with observability where data teams, I would say, until 5 years ago, and even less than that maybe, didn't even really have a view into the lineage. So I think you're pointing to it, but a lot of that downtime can be the result of software engineers who just don't know how the data is used that's emitted from their products. And what I've found is when you start providing that observability, both from a lineage standpoint, so that you understand the dependencies across your data, but also start to proactively detect these incidents, you can communicate proactively and increase the collaboration across teams that are contributing to this data value chain. So an example, I mentioned at the times we had financial data that was derived from our commerce systems. So you had a commerce engineering team, a subscriptions data engineering team, and then a financial reporting team. And that financial reporting data needed to be accurate to the penny of the general ledger, right? And oftentimes the problems were maybe a schema change in the commerce system. And so bringing visibility across those stakeholders, I've seen that be one of the most impactful things to understanding and correlating, what's happening when they're making changes to their system and who's suffering downstream from it.
Okay, that all makes sense. So if you press the over button, and that will take you to the second whiteboard, would you mind diagramming out the actual how architecturally it works? For example, or is this just works on Spark, only works on databases? Is it microservices?
Yeah, and maybe I'll keep this fairly high level, but I think if you think about a customer's data environment over here, a customer's data environment will typically include a lake, a data warehouse. Oh, sorry for my handwriting. Orchestration tools. You'd have ETL tools or ELT, whichever way you think about it. You'll have BI tools, and you might also have some models, sort of some end applications. Where Monte Carlo focuses is on essentially what data you have in cloud environments. So this lake and warehouse for us is predominantly, you can think of Databricks, Snowflake, Google Cloud, Amazon, Redshift and related tools. Their lakes and warehouses are where a lot of the action happens. We also actually, I'd say, have support for a lot of upstream databases like Postgres and MySQL and other databases that are kind of the transactional event stores. And so this might be an example customer's data environment, whatever sort of set of technologies they have. And then the way Monte Carlo will work with this is we have what's called an agent. Sorry, that's not very neat. But we'll have an agent that is essentially taking a read-only view of logs, metadata, and queries and it coming out of these environments, right? And so you can collect a lot of information on the metadata and logs and query logs coming from something like Snowflake or Databricks. But a lot of the hard work our teams do is building these integrations such that our agent picks up useful information. We also have what I'd call like a data store. And this is essentially storing some sample data that often helps in things like root cause analysis. Both the agent and the data store can be either hosted by Monte Carlo or hosted by the customer, depending on the security positioning. And then you have a conversation between this agent and the Monte Carlo cloud service or software as a service solution. And so that's essentially Monte Carlo's user interface. It's where people create the monitors. It's where they set the notification channels for an alert to go. And it contains a whole series of dashboarding as well. But it's essentially the UI that Monte Carlo hosts.
Okay. So the people's infrastructure will be all over the place, as you mentioned. You'll have Databricks. You'll have your various databases. And so agent, to be clear, that agent is not actually doing a query on them or anything active. It's anything specifically active. It's looking at logs and reading, and then you have created code that will look at those logs, so it'll know how to read a Databricks log correctly. Is that right?
Yeah. So exactly, and I think for a lot of these, for something like freshness, you can learn about freshness purely through metadata, right? So the table updates, for example, you can collect that metadata. For something like a field null rate, the query in that case would run in the client's chosen data warehouse, right? You define it in Monte Carlo, but it runs in the client's chosen warehouse. And then it simply reports back a result of that query. And so in that way, we're not, directly reading the customer's data. We're essentially getting results from queries on the customer's data for our deeper monitoring.
Okay. So we'll run over here on their cluster itself would be probably a count, probably a select star from whatever, whereas null from
exactly
timestamps. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And those can be, a lot of those are kind of templatized or designed in Monte Carlo around the sort of core use cases people have. And, they can return distribution, they can return the null rate, as I said, they can return uniqueness of columns. So all of the things that you'd want in terms of validating, but you can also write monitors that are arbitrarily complex SQL for the more business specific checks that you have.
And those would run in once again in your weapon of choice.
Exactly. Defined in Monte Carlo, but run in your weapon of choice.
Okay. So this agent's a microservice, I assume?
Yeah, you're maybe getting to the edge of my understanding, but it's a service that we run, and as I said, that can run in the customer's environment or ours, and it can run in, I think, pretty much every cloud-based sort of environment. So Azure or AWS, wherever you want to run that.
Okay. And then this data store, this is an actual process, or is this your database?
It's a database essentially. So that's, as I said, I think the main purpose for that is really storing sample data that is often used to for in the debugging or root cause analysis approach.
And then all of that gets backhauled. You said that agents could run either in your infrastructure and infrastructure, but looks like the backhaul always has to happen to the Monte Carlo cloud.
That's right.
Okay. And so that'll make sense. And you talked about the observability, that lineage is that lineage figured out automatically through the metadata, or is it some graded in the Monte Carlo UI?
Yeah, so the main thing we rely on there is query logs. So we do a lot of parsing. Monte Carlo does a lot of parsing in query logs. So actually, once we deploy Monte Carlo for a customer, it's, within hours, we've actually created a map of their lineage, of their environment based on those query logs. And if you look in the Monte Carlo UI, I know we don't have that up today, but you'll see the different orchestrators at play, the transformation tools like dbt and Airflow, and how they're used throughout that lineage. So it essentially creates this map of your data environment, and it's absolutely critical then to be able to troubleshoot and triage issues.
Okay. And you talked about that criticality, so I'll just diagram it out real quick. When we were doing things with lineage on observability, and we have this query where we have data in from, let's say, two different tables. When you have the lineage, then you can figure out that if there's a problem here, sometimes the problem isn't actually right here. Sometimes that problem came and then it moved there. And until you have ideally checks over here, figure that out sooner, or you get them right here, that this is when teams spend a lot of time, is when the problem isn't here, the problem is up here.
That's exactly right. And I would say historically, a lot of data quality was looked at through the lens of that end table, where a lot of things were aggregated and merged, and you almost lost track of whether an issue had occurred. I think the premise of observability, and we have something you can build in Monte Carlo around data products, which starts at an endpoint and basically gives you all the dependencies for that data product. But if you have monitoring across all of those layers, you can see it in the raw data, you can see it as it's transformed, you can see it, in conformed data layers and aggregations. And when there's an incident, a Monte Carlo lineage flow will show all of those places where the coincident incident has occurred and allow you to see, to your point, that direct source of where the problem initiated.
And so as somebody is sitting there thinking about this, they could say, okay, got it. I'll go write my own data queries. I can do this myself. It's just a count. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, to be honest, that's the right starting point. And so, when I was at the Times, we actually built a tool called Snitch, which I thought was a pretty good name. One of our teams that had a problem with late data and bad data decided they would put a set of monitors down, and built a tool called Snitch that was pretty good. And a lot of teams start there, and I'd say a lot of organizations build teams around their own observability solutions. It is usually good to start with some homegrown version to appreciate the scope of the problem. I found that the scope of that problem in an organization where data is critical and where the organization is of a certain size is a huge investment, right? You can build thousands of tests and still not cover the space of coverage you need. Automation is critical. And I think oftentimes what teams build is they build the alerting piece of observability, but they don't actually build the workflows around triaging and resolution. So Monte Carlo also has integrations with PagerDuty and with Jira and other workflow tools to make sure that you have this setup in place to, when you get an alert and you decide that that's a Sev 1 incident, you actually have the right connection with the rest of your organization to solve that. And so I think I definitely don't, I see some teams successfully building these capabilities, but at some point, I found as a data lead, you need to kind of pick the areas where you can differentiate your organization and the areas where you should be using off-the-shelf tools. And at least for me, observability wasn't something I wanted to build.
I would take it one step further. I've talked about solve unsolved problems. If you're reinventing a data observability tool, you're solving a problem. And you're saving money or expense saving money, but you're solving a solved problem. No, your CEO is not going to come up and say, "Oh, wow, I love that you wrote snitch." Did that ever happen?
No, it did not, surprisingly.
Surprisingly. He didn't say, "Wow, you saved my company by creating this data observability platform."
I think it was expected that we were finding these problems in the data. That's the thing. Like, a lot of consumers don't know about this problem in the way data engineers and data analysts do, where it's a huge problem for them in building trust in their data environments. And so certainly he didn't see our investment in. I don't think I told our executives about our investment in Snitch. I think it was just something we did. But I think the other thing you're kind of raising, and there's a number of good blog posts of teams that have built a solution, and they'll take 5 engineers full time building this solution, and you're comparing that to a company like Monte Carlo, who has around 100 engineers that are actually constantly working on advancing the feature set. And so I think that's the other benefit of working with a solved problem and a partner around that, is you get some expertise, but you also get this product roadmap focus that I think, you talk to any of our customers is one of the reasons they partner with us.
It definitely is. So there can be a few levels to this of, I'll do it myself, or the company doesn't want to spend the money on it, but an engineer looks cheaper, but it never quite works out. Not saying, go with Monte Carlo, go with whatever competitor. I'm more saying, hey, this is a problem that's solved. Go talk to all of these companies, figure out what's a good one. Solve these unsolved problems. Solve something that only your company can do. Solve something that only you can do because you have the remit, the data, the whatever. It's very clear. It's general purpose. And you make a good point on the 100 engineers. You can't compete with 100 engineers. They may be doing some features you don't need, but they're also doing some features that you do need. And you kind of alluded to the long tail of software. Yeah, you can create a snitch. You could create probably 80% of snitch in a piece. That long tail, that last 20%, that is what's going to kill you. Is that what you experienced?
Yeah, definitely. Like, getting that to the scale where it can serve, it was heavily adopted by one team. And I think it was, for what it was a great solution, but it was heavily adopted narrowly. And to get it adopted by engineers, analysts, data scientists, you need a solution that thinks about those personas and thinks about the user interface and the features they need. And I think that's something that takes a whole squad to build.
Well, good. But let's go to whiteboard 3. And I want to talk about, when you introduced yourself, you talked about doing Monte Carlo with AI. So would you mind whiteboarding out how we would use Monte Carlo with AI?
Sure. We're going to number 3.
Right.
Okay. So I've talked in the role I'm in right now, which is a product research and development role. I've talked to, probably in the range of 40 to 50 teams now around most of them Monte Carlo customers about AI products that they're building. And very often the AI products that data teams are playing a role in or building are ones that are fueled by their data platform, right? So using what's often referred to as RAG pipelines. And so I might just start by drawing out a few components here. Let's start with the data, both structured and unstructured, that exists in your team's data lake and data warehouse. And actually, you could think of above this the kind of sources of that data. And then what you very have commonly in these generative AI infrastructures is a vector database of some sort. And so I'll draw a couple of vectors here, indicate the vector DB. And then maybe if I just think about the flow of this, let's say this is the application you're using on your phone or elsewhere. You might have like a natural language query coming in here, an embedding model that converts that natural language into these vector embeddings that are stored in the database. And then both the vectorized query and context come back to the LLM, which returns a response to the user. So, I know there are tons of different generative AI workflows and even from machine learning, tons of different machine learning workflows, but this is a fairly common one I'm seeing across the sorts of solutions that data teams are building, either for something like a internal or an external chatbot, or often I'm also talking to teams who are building kind of more operational efficiency solutions. How do they take unstructured data that their business values and ramp up that process to structure it and use it in an effective way for the business? And so there's various ways, and maybe to get to the role Monte Carlo plays, there's various ways that this value chain of generative AI can break. And I'll start with the top one, which is a problem in the data. And so this is something that, over Monte Carlo's life, we've worked on how we can quickly identify problems in structured data. And so we talked a bit about the null rate and how you identify an anomalous null rate. But now you've got teams that are also dealing with unstructured data here. And so this could be a knowledge base that's coming from, say, Confluent or some sort of knowledge store. And if that data isn't comprehensive or up to date, then at the endpoint in this workflow, you can have hallucination. And so what Monte Carlo is focused on is how do we monitor the structured and unstructured data in its raw, conformed, whatever form, and also how that unstructured data is ultimately vectorized into embeddings. And so this is the first thing that Monte Carlo can do is find problems in data, in structured and unstructured data. The second problem, which exists across this chain, so I'll just put it here, is a system problem. And so any one of these systems can have downtime. And so this could be an issue with, in the more traditional products, an issue with Airflow or some sort of orchestrator, Or in the case of generative AI, this could be something like LangChain or LangGraph that's used heavily in these projects to manage workflows and deliver the end result. So that's kind of the second point. Monte Carlo monitors a lot of your data platform today, and we're continuing to expand that into this AI world and actually monitor more of these systems. The third aspect I'll just call out is code. So code for data teams can be a bad join that actually breaks this whole chain or breaks this system. It can be, a bad pull request in GitHub. But in the LLM world, it can also be a bad prompt, and various other ways that code can play a role here. And then finally, I just call out, we have the model. So, even once you get perfect data, perfect code and systems, the perfect prompt, these models can do things that are sometimes unexpected. And, sometimes that can be a hallucination, but as I talk to more and more data teams, they're very focused on model evaluation, how accurate this model is, or what's the precision and recall in data science terms, what's the impact that model is having, but also what's the cost of that, and what's the performance of that model. So there's a lot that also comes to play in terms of understanding the model. So there are aspects of all of these that Monte Carlo covers today. And there are also ways that we're extending that coverage of how we monitor systems, code, model, data to the world of generative AI.
Yeah, it's interesting that as much as if you listen to, let's just say OpenAI, for example, the word coming out from them is, oh, our models do great at everything. No need for data quality, no need for checking to make sure that we get hallucinations out. The next version, model 4.0, is going to do this, and it's not going to hallucinate. And no, all of these have problems. You can turn your temperature to try to change it, but it doesn't. Still hallucinates. These are non-deterministic models. So that you kind of alluded to what each piece that Monte Carlo is doing. Are you actually integrating with vector DBs already?
Yeah, so we have an integration today with Pinecone as a vector DB, but even in recent conversations, I'm seeing people use the vector DBs that are in Postgres and Databricks, and so we plan to integrate with more of these based on where we have the highest demand. But our integration with Pinecone, as an example, does some monitoring on these vector namespaces and the vector sizes and various other things to understand anomalous vectors. And when I talk to data teams, they're talking about how they understand the drift in this vector space, how they understand whether it's representative of that data. And so there are a bunch of problems that can take shape in that context that you're providing through the vector embeddings that needs to be reliable and needs to be accurate.
That is interesting. And so,
but I think I was just going to say, I think you're right. Like a lot of the attention these days is around model response, and the more I see data teams getting into these situations, they want to know how they can scale an infrastructure like this and start with internal customers and go to external customers and maintain reliability across this system. And it's more than just, is the LLM good at answering some test questions?
Yes. Creating this system is far more complex than I think people are realizing. I'm doing this now, and we're people are thinking, oh, you just run some low code at this and you can create the system. And I'm sorry, you need actual systems behind this. You need a lot of code behind this, probably more code than I'm honestly surprised how much code I'm having to write to make sure that all of the system works correctly.
The other thing I'm hearing a lot from teams that have this in production is, a new version of the model comes out and suddenly they've got to retrain again because it has unintended consequences. So there's a lot that's hard to observe in this infrastructure today that is squarely the problem that we're tackling.
Well, maybe that's the interesting question. Since when you're in the ability to talk to a lot of teams on something really early like this, you're going to see a pattern. What are the patterns you're seeing emerge in this?
Yeah, so I mentioned one of these patterns is building RAG-based solutions is fairly common, and there's probably some orientation in I'm talking to data, CDOs and VPs in data, and so they're thinking about how they can use their first-party data. But often, another insight is I find, with the experimentation that's happening, user-facing features, like unless they're differentiated, aren't terribly impactful. If you just put a pretty low context chatbot into your product, it's good. It's a good way to experiment, but it's not necessarily finding some unique thread that you can pull on. And so I think the more successful use cases I've seen are data teams that are thinking about how they're, maybe to that question about build versus buy, but thinking about how their data is a superpower to these models. I think I'm seeing multiple classes of use cases. Some that are customer facing, that are often led by product engineering teams with some support from AI or ML experts in the data team, and some that are these intelligent document processing use cases that are led by the data team. How do I take an approach that's very manual and repetitive and use something like this to structure that data that's coming in from images? So there's a customer of ours that's a leading kind of transport and truck stop company. They're called Pilot. And so they have truck drivers who are actually taking images of fuel receipts and sending that in to a process that then structures that using LLMs into valuable data that can expedite the way that they pay for fuel and collect receipts. And it's worth millions of dollars to the business. And so that's the type of use case that I'm seeing data teams unlock, who have played a role in this, but now they're seeing what they can do with unstructured data. I think the other just interesting thing in this space, Jesse, is who owns it? And it's often a question I ask point blank to people, but like, who owns your generative AI initiatives? And it still remains to be seen, like, who's building these applications. But oftentimes I'm finding it is the team that has the background in machine learning that's most likely to be able to recognize the problem that can be solved with generative AI at scale.
That's interesting. I thought my initial hope was that we'd be taking some of the load off the data science teams and putting them into software engineers, but I haven't seen that happen either. I've been surprised.
I think, there's definitely a lot of experimentation I'm seeing in software engineering teams, and some organizational mandate that says every software engineering team should be building with generative AI. I think where I'm seeing like the highest impact is when they either to that software engineering team, they bring in a data scientist or a machine learning expert, or these solutions are run by those teams.
Interesting. So talking more about Monte Carlo, what's exciting you about your roadmap?
Yeah, so well, broadly, I'd say one of the things is this space, so the data and AI observability space, and how we evolve the product and how we get adoption of the features we've built today, but also how we evolve to supporting more of these use cases over time. But I think more specifically, there's a feature that our teams have built internally with generative AI. So we have, of course, we support generative AI, but then we're also building generative AI solutions to improve those data downtime causes. And so we have a monitoring agent already in production that actually plays the role of a data steward or a domain expert in coming up with monitors that should give you better coverage of your data. I won't talk about that one because that's already in production. The one that is in alpha or moving into beta right now is a troubleshooting agent. And so what that does is actually takes a lot of the context of the incident and it spawns a bunch of investigation LLMs that go and look at all of these data system code and model causes of problems. And it doesn't just do that for one table, but it does it recursively upstream. So it finds it with the aim to find the root cause. And then it brings together these potentially hundreds of investigations that are happening in parallel and aggregates a summary of that for the engineer or the analyst so they can see what are the potential causes of that incident. And so the goal there is just to drastically reduce the time it takes for data teams to resolve incidents.
That is interesting. Part of that equation that you were talking about is your equation actually kind of reminded me of the Drake equation of how probable is life outside of our
right.
system. If you start fiddling with any one of those numbers, life either becomes very impossible or not. In a similar way, if we can reduce these times and we can say, oh, found this table, we take a human out of that loop and that human is now more productive to do other things that are more productive for them.
Right. And maybe to that point, you can't reduce the number of SEVs as your infrastructure grows with complexity, or you can't get it to zero. But what if you could get time to resolve an incident to near zero? Then you're starting to approach, zero downtime. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about it. Is like, how do these things work together, and which one can you actually get to zero?
It is. Oh, we will move off the. Okay. Yeah, all right. Good. So in your linked profile, you talked about being a founding member of a thing called Metadata. What trends are interesting to you that you've seen from that particular side of investment?
Yeah. So that, just for a little bit of background, that's a group of around 40 to 50 data leaders who are, leading data teams themselves and also investing in early stage startups where we see the ability for us to provide some guidance to that startup or partnership to that startup based on our experience and where they see an opportunity for the same. It's a really great network, but it's also a good way to stay at the forefront of the technologies. I think obviously a lot of our focus in the last couple of years shifted to these data and AI companies. And, as much as you see obviously big things coming out of Databricks and Snowflake and Google and Amazon, it's been, a lot of my focus there is, all right, what are the startups that are solving either really unique vertical specific problems, or trying to solve part of this stack. There's been vendors, for example, that are doing the whole text to SQL. How do we do that really well and sort of revolutionize the role of business intelligence and how more people can interact with data? But then how do we build and fine tune and assess these AI workflows in companies in a way that more people can be building market ready products? So that's probably the most fertile space and the one that's grabbing the most attention. I also have a huge interest in data privacy back from when I led some work at the Times aimed at really strategically thinking about data privacy and protecting people's data. And so that's also a space that always grabs my attention when we see potential to talk to founders.
That is interesting. I always tell people this: you go to a conference, the most interesting thing is not to go to the big booths. The most interesting thing is to go to the smallest booth. They'll have a booth that narrows just enough for everyone to attend, because they're doing something pretty cutting edge. Usually they're doing something pretty interesting, pretty novel. Go talk to those folks, because there's not a lot of people at our booth usually, but they're doing something that maybe next year or in 2 years, everybody's going to be talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the quality of founders we've met through this process has been amazing. I mean, there's a lot of people, seeking to or building pretty cool stuff.
Good. So coming back to your background and decision science, what is your personal process for making a difficult decision?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things, and I've probably learned this through working with good leaders who are decisive. Coming from a data background for a while, I viewed myself as kind of the impartial analyst, right? Who would bring a lot of evidence and who would bring methodology and would help facilitate decisions. But once you get into a certain level of leadership, I found people expect you to be decisive and be good at actually bringing that opinion forward around the decision. I think so. I think the things that I've learned over time is, one, like really clearly articulate the problem. And we do this at Monte Carlo. We often push each other at an executive level. Like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And have we got that problem right? Because you can waste a ton of time if you're focused on the wrong problem. I think the other thing, and I've seen leaders in my career do this better than me, but I try to do it, which is, how do you bring in, like, it's almost like a sonar ping. How do you get multiple perspectives from very different extremes? Right. And some of that is bringing in people with very diverse backgrounds and opinions, but some of it is like pushing people on throwing out their preconceptions and coming up with the sort of ends of the spectrum that you'll want to experiment with. So that's like also something that experimentation taught me, is like, don't test the things that are, 0.5% apart. Try to look for the things in the range of solutions that you would explore. So we did a lot of optimization at the times where we thought about like this range of solutions that were viable and how we could experiment in that range. And then I think, try to understand the first order consequences of that. What are the outcomes that you care about? Define them up front and understand how you can measure and observe the impact on those. But I think that's probably is best, and then try to be as decisive as possible. I think the failure of a lot of leaders, I think, is trying to capture too much data to make decisions rather than, get just enough data so that you can, use your instinct and also back it up and know that you're going down the right path.
I think I was thinking about
similar to that process I was talking about is and that safety of no is a decision is better than no decision. You
Mhm.
make a decision, but at least you may not be in any degree, but you may be off on this. You're actually making progress toward it, but you can always pivot and make your way back.
For sure. Definitely agree with that.
Shane, thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun, Jesse. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you.